In this video, I'll be showing you how to solder electrical wires. First, I'm going to go over everything I have laid out here. This is everything that I'll be using to solder. First off, we have a soldering gun and we have a soldering iron. These two devices have the same purpose. Their purpose is to heat up the wires so that we can melt the solder onto the wires. Next, we have heat shrink tubing. The heat shrink tubing you put over the soldered joint once it's soldered, and you heat it up and it'll shrink and stay in place over the joint to protect it from the elements. Here we have, of course, electrical tape. You can use the electrical tape in conjunction with the heat shrink tubing, or you could use it separately. It's just that the heat shrink tubing is a more reliable way to cover the joint. So I'll be showing you how to use them together and separately. And to shrink the heat shrink tubing, I'm going to be using a lighter. You could also use a heat gun like this, it works similar to a hair dryer, except it's a much higher power. And next I have some wire strippers. These will be used to strip the coating off the wires to reveal the copper wires that are on the inside. Then we have the solder. The solder I'll be using is 6040 rosin core solder. This is very good for electrical wires. And in here I have a bit of that solder inside here and in this smaller container to make it more convenient to handle and use. Here I have flux paste. This is to basically clean the wires and prepare them for the solder. And then I have sandpaper here and a razor blade. The sandpaper I'll be using to clean the tip on the soldering iron, and also to clean some of the wire that has corrosion on it. And also the razor blade I'll be using to clean off corrosion off the wires. Alright, so the first thing we do is strip the sheath off the wires. You generally want to strip off about ½ an inch or 12 millimeter. Sometimes you may need more or less. And once you have the exposed wire, you should twist it tightly. Do the same thing to the other side. Alright. And you put the two wires together in an X pattern. And if you're going to be using heat shrink tubing, now's the time to go ahead and cut off a piece and slide it over one of the wires. But since the ends of my wires are open, I'll be able to just slide it on after it's soldered. But in most cases, the other end of the wire won't be accessible, so it's best to put the heat shrink tubing on prior to soldering. Alright, so now we put it in an X shape, and we just twist them together. Just like that. And now, next thing to do is, if you solder it like this, once the wires are soldered, they're not movable and pliable like they are right now. So it's a good idea to go ahead and push the wrapped portion of the wires down so that they'll have a nice low profile, so that they won't extrude and have a greater chance of shorting out on something or taking up too much space. So next thing I'm going to do is apply some of the flux paste. This isn't something you always have to do, it's just something I like to do usually when I solder. And when you apply the flux paste, you can use a flathead screwdriver and just get the paste all over the wire. ready to solder. So I'm going to get my solder and make sure you have a pretty good amount out and ready to be melted. So since I'm using the heat gun, it's going to heat up quickly, and I'm just going to turn it on, and I'm going to tin the tip, meaning that I'm going to apply a little bit of the solder onto the tip. So let it heat up. Once it's heated, got the solder on there. And now the portion with the solder is the portion that'll make contact with the wires, and that way it'll efficiently transfer the heat from the soldering gun into the wire, because the solder helps fill up the spaces and transfer the heat more quickly. And since heat goes up, we're going to put the tip of the soldering gun underneath the wire, and then we're going to apply the solder onto the wire, not onto the tip of the soldering gun. So, on. Once it's heated up, put it onto the wire. It'll heat up the wire, and once the wire is heated enough, the solder will melt directly onto the wire itself. And you may have to apply more solder onto the tip. And you want to make sure that the solder is all around the wires. So this one's on there. This one has the solder on all around it, so that's a good strong solder joint. So the next thing is to cover it up. You can use electrical tape, or if you have heat shrink tubing, you can use the heat shrink tubing. And so you should let it cool down for a few seconds. And if you use the flux paste, there may be some residue. You could wipe that off if you'd like, but I'm just going to go ahead and put the heat shrink tubing on it, and then I'm going to use a lighter to shrink it. I'm going to do it to the top and bottom, and that's it. Now it's covered, and that's a professionally soldered wire. If you want to, you can also wrap the electrical tape onto the joint and then put the heat shrink tubing over it, because electrical tape tends to unravel over time, and the heat shrink tubing will keep it from unraveling, and so that's double protection. So, but this is just fine. And now I'll show you another way that you can wrap the wires together, because the issue with having it like this is that this is good and this is nice and strong. There's nothing wrong with this, but the problem is that wrapping the wires together in this way causes it to kind of extrude quite a bit, and it's where the joint is soldered at, it's much thicker than the wire itself, so this takes up more space. So in cases where you have to save space, there's another thing you can do. Here I have my pre-cut wires. Now we're going to put it into an X pattern just like before, but this time we're going to put it about halfway through the wires. And then we're going to wrap the wires onto each other, and basically the goal is to have them flat. As you can see, wrapping it in this way has it nice and flat, and it's almost the same size as the wire originally was, so this will help save space. So now we just do the same thing as last time. Our soldering gun, or you can also use the soldering iron. Tin the tip once it's heated up. Okay. And this time I'm not going to apply any of the flux paste, just to show that you can also solder without it. Alright. Now, it's a good solder joint. The solder is all around the wires, and so that's good and strong and it'll last. And again, you can use the heat shrink tubing if you'd like. And that's it. And as you can see, this has a much lower profile than our previous soldered joint. So if you need to save space, you can do it this way. And these are pretty much both equally strong, so you can do it either way. It's just normally I do it this way. If I don't have to worry about space, this is normally the way I do it. But either way is fine. Alright, once you strip the coating off the wire, you should inspect the wire, and it should have a shine to it. It should be pretty shiny, and it should have an even color to it. In some cases, the wire will be corroded even though it's protected by the sheath, just like this one is right here. As you can see, this one doesn't have as much of a shine to it. This one also doesn't have an even color. It has some brownish looking spots, and that's a clear indication that it has some corrosion on it. Solder only adheres to clean metal. If it has corrosion on it, or it's oily or dirty, the solder isn't going to properly bond with it. And the same thing goes for the tip of the soldering iron or soldering gun. You always want to tin the tip by applying a bit of solder to it, and if the tip is real oxidated, real dirty, the solder won't even want to stay on the tip. Even if it melts onto the tip, it'll likely roll off rather than stay on the tip. And so the way we clean dirty wires like this, we either use a razor blade or we can use some sandpaper. I typically use a razor blade because it's just quicker to do. So you pretty much just scrape around the entire wire until the whole thing has a nice shine to it. Now as you can see, it looks much better than it did before. It looks pretty close to the brand new wire I have here. So the other way to clean it, by using the sandpaper, would pretty much be just wrapping it in the sandpaper like this, and then just pull and twist in the same direction that you have the wires twisted. This method takes longer to do, so I usually just use the razor blade. The tip of your soldering iron or soldering gun should be nice and clean like this. And if you keep the tip tinned with the solder, it shouldn't get corroded as long as you keep it tinned. Basically because it's not going to corrode when it has the solder on there. It kind of protects the tip. But if it does get dirty and you need to clean it, mine's is clean, but you would pretty much just take the sandpaper and just clean it up real nice until it's nice and shiny, and then the solder will adhere to it. And you make sure you clean the tip when it's cool, not when it's heated.